Welcome to BICOM's weekly podcast. I'm BICOM CEO James Serene, and to coincide with the publication of our new research paper about Britain-Israel relations, I'm delighted to be joined this week by the ambassador to London, the ambassador of Israel, Mark Regev. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
If I could just start off, you've been here nearly 4 years now. What do you see as the real changes that you've seen in the Britain-Israel partnership?
I think we've seen over the last few years real momentum in the relationship, real energy. I think British-Israel relations today are in a stronger place than they were 5 years ago, than they were 10 years ago, and the momentum is very positive. And I see this in all the areas of the relationship. I see this in trade, I see this in defense cooperation, I see this in engagement at the highest level. We are in a very good place at the moment, and I believe this time next year we'll be in an even better place.
What do you think are the real growth areas in that partnership over the next few years that you expect to see?
Well, economic cooperation, trade, is an area where we're seeing much movement. We've reached now about £9 billion in bilateral trade. Now, over the last few years, every year is a new record year in bilateral trade. That's jobs, that's prosperity in both countries. I expect next year to be higher than this year. We've already signed a trade agreement, so when Brexit comes into place, we can continue to see the trade move, continue to see our economic relationships, our economic partnerships go from strength to strength. So I'm very optimistic about that part of the relationship. It's almost as if Israeli technology with the excellence of British industry, it's a perfect match. We don't compete directly in most areas, we complement each other. So I believe we have great room to see the economic relationship continue to grow. On tourism, do you know, I think you've now got half a dozen companies, airlines, flying from Israel to the UK. I mean, in the old days, you used to just have the two national carriers. You had British and El Al. Today, you've got EasyJet, you've got Wizz Air, you've got Ryanair, and now, a few months ago, we had for the first time Virgin Atlantic flying on the route. And when I fly on these planes, they're always full. We've got record numbers of British tourists coming to Israel. We've got record numbers of Israelis coming to Britain. That's another area where there's no doubt the situation is very, very positive. If we look at defense cooperation, last year I was at RAF Waddington to see Israeli Air Force pilots train here in Britain for the first time with RAF pilots. Our Air Force is good. The British Air Force is good. When we work together, when we train together, we're making ourselves even better. So that sort of partnership, and it's not just between the air forces, we see it in all other areas as well. We're seeing a relationship that is getting stronger.
And beneath the trade figures, there's some very big numbers that you're talking about there. There's some really interesting collaboration, isn't there? And it's tech, it's healthcare, fintech. I mean, what have been the most surprising examples that you've seen of that, some of the really inspiring things? Because you obviously see a lot of this, you're going to a lot of these launches and meetings. What are the things that have really struck you that are really surprising?
Two things. First of all, people don't know, but 1 in 7 medicines that people get through the Britain's NHS is provided by an Israeli pharmaceutical company. That's one huge area that people aren't aware of. Another thing that I think there is a growing awareness of is British interest in Israeli technology. When I go to the city, when I speak to investors, they are seriously focused today on the possibilities, on the opportunities in the Israeli tech sector. It's very exciting. I don't know how many delegations I've seen of investors, of people going to Israel to look at technology, to see where the growth areas are, what are the startups that are worth investing in, and where can British industry partner with Israeli technology to produce added value for British products.
And we've heard a lot about the UK tech hub that's based in the British Embassy in Israel, and how important that is in building partnerships and bringing Israeli and British companies together. Is that a unit that your embassy now works with a lot more, or have you got ideas maybe to have a similar sort of tech hub in London that works with that hub? What's the future of that model? Because it's going to be rolled out by the British government in other embassies.
Correct. We think it's a very successful model. We work closely with the British government to promote that sort of cooperation between the two countries. We also see it in the academic sphere, where both governments are encouraging joint research projects. We've got the BIREX program, which is very successful. And ultimately, if we talk about research, if we talk about science, there's excellence in both Israel and the UK. And by working together, by doing collaborative research, we're ultimately helping science and we're helping humanity. You know, we're working through the BIREX projects on medical issues, specifically aging. And if we can make breakthroughs in these areas, we'll find solutions that help people across the entire planet.
It's a much wider impact. If I could just talk about what's changed in terms of the threats that Britain and Israel face, some of the commonalities around particularly the sort of national security, counter-terrorism. It seems like the way that those threats have changed, the growing threat from sort of Salafi jihadi terrorism, other threats from sort of Iranian-sponsored terrorist organizations, has that brought Britain and Israel and those agencies closer together under your watch over the last few years? Or do you think that was a trend that was going on for much longer? How do you see that?
It's been there for years, but there's no doubt that the relationship has been energized over the last few years. The truth is that a lot of the forces out there that want to harm Israel also want to harm the United Kingdom. And by working together closely, we make both our peoples safer. And so we've seen a defense cooperation expand. We've seen counter-terrorism cooperation grow even stronger. Intelligence cooperation has always been strong and remains so. Our national security relationship is in a good place. When my Prime Minister was here last year, he said publicly, he said, our relationship on these issues is saving British lives, it's saving Israeli lives. As I said, our peoples are safer and more secure because of that sort of cooperation.
And just to talk about another area which is around common threats, but also sometimes a source of divergence but on policy, which is around Iran and the Iran nuclear deal. And it's been, no secret that for some years that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the government were very, very opposed to the nuclear deal, saw a lot of flaws in it, whereas at the same time Britain was a key signatory to the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. And that's been perhaps a source of tension. And it's been clear that both countries agreed on the problem of stopping Iran getting a nuclear bomb, but they really did disagree on the solution. Have you seen that change? Because we've been tracking this very closely, like a lot of other observers, and you've definitely seen a little bit of a shift in the UK government, like Boris Johnson talking about getting the Trump deal, triggering the dispute mechanism in the actual nuclear deal itself just last week. What do you see might happen? Can you see the British government it's really losing patience with Iran on the nuclear deal? Do you want to say something about how that's maybe changed in the British government approach?
I think it's understood today increasingly that the Iranians, through the deal, could get international support, economic support that they badly needed. At the same time, they continued their very aggressive and nefarious policies in the region, whether it was the missile program, whether it was supporting terrorism, was it creating instability in countries like Iraq and Syria and so forth. In other words, they could have their cake and eat it too. That the nuclear deal actually didn't stop them getting a nuclear weapon, and at the same time helped them come out of the cold and receive economic benefits that actually gave fuel for their motor for all these negative behaviors they're doing, their missile program, the terrible things they did in Syria and so forth. So I think there's an increasing understanding today that the Iranians have to be confronted on their bad behavior, that they must never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. And I have no doubt that in the West, that position today, including in Britain, is understood better.
And could you just talk about some of the other elements of your role, which I think you've seen some things that your predecessors have not seen. So you saw the first official royal visit by Prince William in 2018, and just this week, His Royal Highness Charles, the Prince of Wales, will be going. There's a part of your job that people probably don't realise, which is that they know that you're here hosting the Israeli officials and leaders and prime ministers, but you also go to Israel on all these visits, and you're there behind the scenes and you're sort of helping with that hosting. Could you perhaps give us a sense of what that's like? Because I imagine that's a fascinating thing that our listeners would want to hear about.
So in 2018, when Prince William came to Israel, it was the first official visit ever by a senior British royal to the Jewish state. And as such, it was historic. The Prince of Wales had been to Israel twice, but in the framework of attending funerals, not as a standalone official visit. And so I remember being there, and I remember when he met Israeli officials, and I saw the way the Israeli public received him in a very warm way. It was understood that it was historic. The Prince of Wales, as you've said, will be in Israel this week. That'll be the second important visit by a senior UK royal, and we'll once again be rolling out the red carpet. My job as ambassador, of course, is to make sure, in coordination with my British colleagues, to make sure that the visit, everything is planned and goes off without a hitch. I'll be arriving in Israel a few hours before the Prince of Wales this week to make sure that I'm there to welcome him and then to see him off when he leaves and with him throughout his program in Israel.
Final question that just get you to reflect on is what do you feel has been something that you've done that's really struck you, that epitomised the depth of the Britain-Israel partnership? I mean, when I did a similar interview with David Quarry just as he left Israel, he actually surprised me with his answer. He said actually it was Shimon Peres's funeral, and it was a little bit unexpected, but he said actually the sheer amount of British VIPs and former leaders that arrived in Israel very quickly for that funeral really took him aback and gave him a real sense of just how long and deep this partnership is and how much it meant to some of these people. I just wonder if I could ask you a similar question. What is it you've done here in London that really showed you just how close this partnership has become?
I remember when the then Prime Minister Theresa May came to the embassy to sign the book, the condolence book for Shimon Peres. I think she came directly from the Conservative Party conference, and I was very moved that she came on a very, very busy day to sign the book. And shortly after that, we flew to Israel for the funeral, and I, like Ambassador Quarry, I remember the size of the British delegation, and it was very, very impressive. For my high point, I would have to add the visit to RAF Waddington to see the Israeli Air Force pilots train with their British counterparts.
That was the first time the Israeli Air Force has ever flown over British skies.
We've done training exercises in the East Med, but this is the first time over British soil. And for me, it represented the strength of the partnership. Let's be frank, my Israeli Air Force pilots rightly think that they're pretty good, right? They are confident in their professional abilities. And I have no doubt that the RAF pilots similarly believe that they are very good, and I'm sure they are. But by having our Air Force train with your Air Force, having the Israeli Air Force train with the RAF, that is something new, and that is something very good, because when our pilots train with yours, that's two good air forces can become even better and learn from each other. And I remember going to RAF Waddington, and there was a special mess established for the Israeli Air Force pilots in a larger tent, and they were receiving kosher food. And I remember smiling. This must be the first time in a long, long time that kosher food was being served at RAF Waddington. Yeah.
And you've got a special connection to RAF as well, because I know that because of Bomber Command and what happened with your own family, that you have that quite special link as well, don't you?
That's correct. My family, my father and his siblings were in Magdeburg, Germany, in a very precarious situation. A Jewish family in Nazi Germany, living in. My grandfather was a slave laborer, and they were living in a very precarious and dangerous situation. And one night the RAF Bomber Command bombed the place very heavily. And in the smoke and the confusion and the chaos, they literally ripped off the Jewish stars that the Nazi regime forced them to wear, and they escaped to the countryside where they were in hiding until liberation. And in many ways, the RAF saved my family. Without that raid, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. Well, Mark Regev, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining the podcast.
Pleasure.